All right, so here we are. You made it. Welcome to the show. This is a very exciting moment in your day. We are going to answer the only question that matters. This is the whole thing. Let's forget for a minute about all those random verses in Leviticus about, rape and slavery. Really important stuff, right? Really, really heavy, important stuff. But let's forget about that. Let's forget about premarital sex. Let's forget about abortion. Let's forget about homosexuality. Let's put all that stuff on the shelf. None of that means a rip without the answer to this question. Did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Like all of Christianity, all that other stuff, important stuff, it all hinges on the answer to this one question. If you are going to follow Christ, if you are going to devote your life to Christ, if you're going to surrender your life to His will, then you're going to need to answer this question. Obviously in the affirmative, but you're going to need to answer this question. And hey, if you're going to dismiss Christianity, if you're going to reject Christianity, you're going to reject the gospel, you're going to reject that Jesus was indeed the Son of God and God Himself, then you are also going to need to answer this question, either, directly or indirectly. And here's the deal. If you follow that latter path, like if you decide that, hey, Christianity, I reject that as truth, I reject what the Bible says, I reject the message of the gospel, then the truth is, who cares about everything else? Right? Who cares about all that other stuff? Who cares about what the Bible has to say about abortion? Who cares about what the Bible has to say about premarital sex? Who cares about those verses in Leviticus that are really, really difficult to understand, that are really, really difficult to decipher? And so what I want to focus on in this little series that you have now stumbled into and you are going to find yourself binge watching for the next 2 hours, that's what I want to do. I want to answer that question. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Because if He didn't, then the Bible's nothing more than a paperweight. The Bible's nothing more than, something that belongs in the trash. But if He did, then that changes everything. Well, welcome aboard. My name is Jim Schultz. Super long preamble there into the old intro. My name is Jim Schultz with F Cubed and livefcubed.com, and I'm going to be your tour guide. I'm going to be your tour guide throughout this little journey that we're going to take together. And look, spoiler alert, I love Jesus. I love me, the Lord of the universe, Jesus Christ. And so I'm going to be a little bit biased in my presentation of this information. Of course, I can't possibly hide that. I can't get around that. But I'm also going to try to be fair. I'm also going to try to be balanced in understanding both sides of the argument, and understanding, the criticisms and the shortcomings and the pitfalls and, honestly, the leaps of faith that you have to make. Right? Like the whole thing I want to do for the next 6 videos, I want to separate fact from faith. Like, what do we know for a fact about Jesus' death, His resurrection? Did He really rise from the dead? What can we say with factual certainty? There are some things we can say with factual certainty, but there are some other things that are going to require a leap of faith. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that because my goal, my objective is to give you all, a foundation, a catalyst, so that you can answer that question for yourself. Of course, I'm going to be a little bit biased. I certainly hope and pray that you too will answer this in the affirmative, but it's more important for me to give you all, a foundation to work from. And so for the next 6 videos, this is what we're going to do. And, my only request, if you're going to answer this question for the first time, did Jesus really rise from the dead? It's an important question, right? Maybe you've never stopped and thought about that. Maybe you have, fall on one side of the belief camp, but you've never actually stopped and said, hey, wait a second. How do I actually feel about that one question? It's a pretty important question. My only request is, if you're going to take this journey with me, which you may have already clicked off by now, and if you have, you didn't even hear me say that. But if you have, then it doesn't even matter. But if you're still here, then you obviously heard what I just said. But anyway, if you're going to take this journey with me, here's my only request. Well, it's actually twofold. Number one, you need to watch all of the videos in the series for 2 reasons. You need to watch all the videos in the series. Reason number 1, brother needs that YouTube watch time. Reason number 2 is we're going to come at this thing from a few different angles. We're going to come at this thing from a couple different perspectives and vantage points. And I want you guys to have the fullest possible picture, the completest possible, rundown of what we know. And, what's a fact, what's fiction, what's belief, what's faith, all of that kind of stuff. And so I hope that you'll hang around for the rest of the series. I hope that we will help you answer this question. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And so you made it. I'm very excited that you're still here and I haven't scared you off yet. So let's get started with video number 1, the empty tomb of Jesus. All right, so the empty tomb of Jesus. Let's put it right out there. Let's start strong. Fact. The tomb of Jesus was empty. A pretty important little detail if he's going to rise from the dead, right? Pretty important little detail if he is indeed going to ascend back into heaven, which is what we all believe as Christians. This is a fact, and here's why. I'm going to give you guys a few different ways to look at this. Number 1, it is mentioned in all 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It is mentioned in Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 7, Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 4, Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12, and John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Now, sometimes we'll bring the scripture actually up, we'll work through it, we'll talk through it, might even bring it on the screen depending on how the tech is treating me that day. Other times I may just reference the verses and then I'll link to them down in the show notes so you guys can click on them yourselves and you can see the references made to Jesus' tomb being empty. Now, this is important for at least one really, really big reason. Not every single event of Jesus' life, his teaching, his ministry, his death was mentioned in all 4 Gospels, right? Different Gospels come at Jesus' life from different angles. And so this thing, obviously very, very important, very central to the idea of a resurrected Christ, it shows up in all 4 Gospels. So clearly, it's pretty important. So for that reason alone, we can start to attach some weight to the idea that Jesus' tomb was empty. Now, I respect the fact that some of you out there, some of you that might be a little bit more skeptical, some of you that might be a little bit more critical of this idea of a resurrected Christ, you might be saying, wait a second, Jim, wait a second. Aren't you kind of, you're taking the Gospels, right? And you're using the Gospels to corroborate Jesus's having been resurrected from the grave, right? Aren't you kind of using the thing to prove the existence of the thing? Like, isn't that a little bit circular to you? Like, don't you kind of have some problems with that? And honestly, that's fair. Like, that's a really, really fair criticism. And the answer is no, I don't have any problems with it for the reasons we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes. But if you only had that as your supporting evidence for an empty tomb, I could respect the fact that you might have some problems with that. I could completely respect the fact that you might feel like, yeah, that's a little bit incomplete, bro. Like, I'm going to need a little bit more than that. But for those of you that are looking for a little bit more than that, that's going to go even over and above what we're going to talk about here for the next couple of minutes. Check out some of William Craig's stuff. I'm going to link to his stuff down below. I read some of his stuff in preparation for this series. I'm somewhat familiar with his work. He's an unbelievable apologist for the Christian faith. Take a look at some of William Craig's stuff down below. He kind of gets into how if you actually look at the Gospels, you can see that they're kind of leaning on outside sources, divinely inspired outside sources, of course. But he comes at it from a slightly different angle, and I think it's really, really interesting. So I'll link to his stuff down below. But nevertheless, at this point, you might be wanting more. Fair enough, because I've got more for you. All right, so maybe the gospel writers and their claims are not enough for you. Hey, I respect that. Totally respect that. So let's add a few more logs to the fire. First one is this. It was women who discovered the tomb. It was women who discovered the tomb. Now, why is that important? Why is that significant? Well, in that time, in the 1st century, women's testimony. Now, there are some huge women's rights issues here, but let's put that on the shelf, next to the cooking spray and the molasses and the vanilla, right next to, homosexuality and abortion and premarital sex. Let's put this up there for the time being. We can bring it back down another time. Women's testimony in that time was pretty much worthless. It wasn't really worth very much at all. It had no value in the world that the Jews and the Gentiles lived in the 1st century. So to write and to suggest and to record that women were the ones who discovered Jesus' empty tomb, man, that's really, really crazy. That's really, really crazy because if this were a lie, right? If I was one of the gospel writers and I'm like, man, I'm going to pull one over on history. I'm about to pull the wool over the eyes of mankind. And I'm going to lead them down a path that is just total fiction, a complete lie. I would never never in a million years have women discovering the tomb. Because I knew in that day and age that their testimony wasn't worth anything. Who would I choose to build up my story, right? Who would I choose to be my hero? Well, it wouldn't be a heroine, it would be a hero, right? It would be some male, influence of power and respect and esteem. It would not be a woman. So the simple fact that it was women who discovered the tombs, or the tomb, it was women, plural, who discovered the tomb, singular. That leads us to believe that this must be what indeed happened. This must be what indeed they saw, right? An empty tomb. Now, that still might not be enough to get you to the tomb actually being empty, because you're like, hey, Jim, this is still just what the gospel writers recorded. Okay. Well, thirdly, check this out. This is really cool. I actually didn't know this. I didn't know this until I started doing research for this series. So huge shout out to Desiring God for bringing this little factoid to my attention. Apparently, in that time, in that world, it was customary to build a shrine, to construct a shrine on the tomb of a holy man's bones. Now, again, we are a long ways away from getting to a resurrected Christ. We are a long ways away from Jesus as the Messiah of the world. Like, I can respect that and I can understand that. But I think we can all agree that Jesus was at least a holy man. Right? I think we can all agree that Jesus was indeed, a religious figure in that day and time, and of course in the history of the world. And so when he died, you would have expected there to be a shrine, enacted on his tomb, but there wasn't. There was no shrine. There was no monument that was constructed on his tomb. Why not? Because my man's bones weren't there. Right? Because he wasn't in the tomb. His bones were not laid to rest at that spot. And so again, another piece of evidence for indeed an empty tomb. Okay, so moving right along, we've got a couple more that I want to get into, but before we do, man, if you guys want to help support this video, if you guys want to help support this series, the best thing you can do right now is comment below. Light me up in that comment box, man. Questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, emojis, I don't even care. Just light me up in that comment box, because YouTube loves comments, so do I. Fourthly, and this might even be the most convincing argument, and this doesn't rely on the Gospels, this doesn't rely on women testimony, this doesn't rely on anything. Very quickly after the claim was made that Jesus' tomb was empty, the skeptics, the critics, the Jewish authorities, they all weren't super keen on this idea of a risen Christ, right? They weren't super on board with this idea of Jesus having been resurrected. You know what they did? They didn't say the tomb wasn't empty. They didn't say, no, the tomb clearly has Jesus' bones in it. What did they say? They said the disciples stole the body. They said, you're looking in the wrong spot. Jesus is buried somewhere else, etc., etc. So what did they do? They basically conceded the fact that the tomb was empty. They basically just gave us that, piece of information as indeed a fact. So that right there, that clearly identifies that the tomb was indeed empty, because if it weren't, then the authorities would have just simply said, hey, Peter, Paul, Mary, why don't you guys, chill out on those jam sessions, and there's your boy right there, right? I got him right here. Like, it's over. It's game over, right? But that didn't happen. That didn't happen because the tomb was empty. That didn't happen because Jesus wasn't there. In fact, you even have, I found this in my research too. I learned quite a bit going through this series. This has been extremely beneficial for me and enlightening for me. I've really enjoyed putting this thing together. I hope you guys do too, of course. But I found a little thing called the Toldoth Jesu. I'm probably not even saying that correctly, but that's how it sounds to me in terms of how it looks on the screen here. This is a compilation of early Jewish writings, and it is effectively an alternative biography of Jesus. They weren't exactly super pro-Jesus, right? They kind of describe him as an illegitimate child who practiced, magic and hearsay, and he died a shameful death. So they weren't exactly, on board with the risen Christ. They also concede that the tomb was empty. And I'll link down to some resources on the old Toldoth Jesu down below, so you guys can check that out yourselves. So we can reasonably conclude all of that the tomb was indeed empty. In fact, my man J. Warner Wallace over at Cold Case Christianity, this guy is amazing. I'll link to him down below too. I'm going to bring him up a couple times throughout this series. Really interesting guy. Used to be, or maybe still is, a homicide detective, and he used to be an atheist. And he used his detective skills to basically put the resurrection of Jesus to the test. Like he, looked at the evidence, he looked at, what we knew, what we don't know, and, what is fact and what is fiction and all that kind of stuff. And he just concluded yeah, it actually happened, right? Well, he said that when your opponent concedes a fact that helps your case, it has a term in the world of homicide detectivery. It's referred to as reluctant admission. And so by reluctant admission alone, right, we're starting the series off strong, man. Fact cannot be disputed. Jesus' tomb was indeed empty. All right, so lastly, one more point that I want to make before I let you guys go and we move swiftly into video number 2, because I want to make all of these available to you guys. As soon as you saw one, you can go right into the next one. The next one's going to start right after this video ends, and you can also find the links down below in the show notes. But just to really make our point today, you also have the simple fact that the disciples, that when Jesus died and he was resurrected, allegedly, right, appeared to disciples amongst many others, and then he ascended into heaven. The disciples started preaching fearlessly, relentlessly, and we're going to talk about this in a later video in the series. But they started preaching right on the spot. They started preaching right where Jesus died. So once again, right, if Jesus' body had been there, it could have easily been discovered, because when the disciples started preaching and Christianity started to, take hold and kind of get some momentum and all these things we're going to talk about later on in the series, when all that started happening, there were a lot of people that did not want it to happen. There were a lot of people that were like, man, this is not good. Like, we need to stop this. We need to squash this thing immediately. So once again, if Jesus' body could have been found, it would have been found. If Jesus' body could have been found, it would have been, Bob, you might want to come check this out, because I got your boy's body right here, right? Never happened. It never happened because Jesus' body wasn't in the tomb. Jesus' body was gone. Now, naturally, we're a long ways away from a resurrected Christ, right? Like, naturally, we still got a ways to go. We still got some work to do, right, to answer the question, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I can respect that. But I think we can all start, all of us, right? Believers, non-believers, the helpers, the haters, right? The critics, the skeptics, the whatever the antonym to those are. I think we're all in the same boat here. This is indeed a fact. Jesus' tomb was empty. So there you have it, man. Jesus' tomb was indeed empty. That is how we're going to begin this series. And this basically brings us to the end of video number 1. Jesus was not in the tomb. So naturally, that begs the question, where did he go? Right? Maybe he was resurrected, or maybe something else, right? Maybe he wasn't resurrected. Maybe his body was just stolen, like those Jewish authorities said in the beginning, right? Maybe somebody just snagged his body and put it somewhere else. This is a well-documented, this is probably the most popular counterclaim to the idea of Jesus's body being resurrected. It wasn't resurrected. It was stolen. So we are going to explore this little stolen body theory in the next video, which again is about to start in 10 seconds or maybe 20 seconds, or you can find it in a link down in the show notes. If you guys want to hit me with a like or a share or a subscribe if you're brand new to the channel on your way out, that would be absolutely amazing. If you guys are listening to this on the audio only version, like on a podcast like Apple or Spotify or whatever, if you want to take a brief, break and just leave me a rating and a review before we get into video number 2, that would also be terrific. But here we go, video number 2, the stolen body theory, eh? I'll see you guys there.